Two or virtual members have the option to appear either in person or virtually. Ohioans know how we let our infrastructure languish for far too long. President after president promised infrastructure investment, promised investment and sanction in public transit. President after president failed, and this Congress failed until President Biden, until we have a new Senate. Some of the most important work we've done this Congress and the Banking and Housing Committee is writing the most significant investment ever in public transit under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It's not just about the numbers, it's about what this investment will do, how this will matter in people's lives. It will mean transit agencies can run more buses and trains more often in more neighborhoods. Last year, Darrell Haley with Cincinnati Metro testified at our first hearing of the year on transit. This is our first one since the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed. He talked about one worker at a restaurant in suburban Cincinnati. She had to spend her entire day's paycheck on an Uber to get to work because her regular bus didn't run on Sundays. And her employer said, you have to show up to work on Sunday. She couldn't miss her shift without risking that job. The bus didn't come when she needed it. It prevented an entire day's hard work from paying off. It happens to her almost every single week. Multiply that times hundreds, times thousands, times tens of thousands of low-income workers. With the infrastructure bill, we have the potential to change the lives of workers like her. We can run buses on Sunday. We can run trains more often. We can add routes. We can add stops. It will make it faster and easier for people who already use public transit to get to work. People who work long, hard days on their feet too often have to take 45-minute two buses to get home and are dog-tired when they're trying to care for their families. It's going to open up new job opportunities when people aren't limited by where the bus or the train runs. It's going to make subways and buses and streetcars a viable option for the first time for millions of new riders. Right now, so many families feel the pain of high gas prices because of Russia's attack on Ukraine. They have no choice but to pay those high prices because they have to get to work, they have to get to school, they have to get to the grocery store. If there's a reliable bus or train, workers won't have to choose between paying for gas or making rent. It's going to make such a difference, especially in so many communities that haven't had reliable transit. It's the black and brown communities who have been historically cut off from job centers. It's rural workers where walking isn't an option. For our nation's seniors, a van or a bus from the local transit service is a lifeline to the doctor, for dialysis treatment, to the grocery store, to church. Because of the work we did on this committee, not only are we going to run buses more often, they'll be cleaner, they'll be newer, they'll be safer buses. One of our witnesses today showed me some of those buses in Columbus several months ago. More communities are going to be able to get new state-of-the-art zero-emission buses on the road. It's going to fight climate change. It's going to clean up the air in our communities. The administration's already accepting applications for the zero-emission bus grants we passed. I've seen how Ohio agencies like Lake Trent and SARTA and CODA are leading the country in deploying these pollution-free buses. Over the coming year, we'll see them in communities all over my state and Georgia and all over this country. We made sure that these workers will get the training they need to work on these new buses. On this committee and under this president, workers will always have a seat at the table. I want to thank the members of our committee for the work to get this done. Republican Ranking Member Toomey and I don't see eye to eye on many issues, as we know, but we were able to reach agreement to reauthorize federal transit administration programs. We can both be proud that cities, the largest metropolitan areas in our state, cities like Cleveland and Philadelphia, can replace rail cars that date back literally to the Carter administration. Our Housing and Transit Subcommittee Chair, Tina Smith, and the subcommittee's ranking members, Senator Rounds from South Dakota, did great work to improve rural transit and tribal transit. Senator Menendez and Senator Reed continue to be leaders in fighting for a fair share of funds for transit, making sure that that historic 20% figure is met or exceeded, and we exceeded it. Senator Tester, Senator Warner, Senator Sinema played a key role in ensuring the committee's transit title moved forward in the bipartisan negotiations, working with the Republican members of the bipartisan group. Senator Warner and Senator Van Hollen fought to reauthorize funds for America's subway, the Washington, D.C. metro system, and Senator Van Hollen's legislation to improve safety plans gives workers a stronger voice in safety matters. Senators Warnock and Ossoff helped us fight for better bus rapid transit and better planning. And Senator Cortez Masto contributed provisions to link transportation planning with housing needs. I want to thank Senator Warren and other members of our caucus who have continued to advocate for zero emission buses. After the difficult times of the pandemic, the future for public transit and for infrastructure is finally brighter. I will spend the coming months working with cities and townships, in counties and villages in Ohio to make sure every community knows all the opportunities available to them to improve their transit systems. Today, after meeting with some national transit officials, I met the transit leader in Perry County, a rural county southeast of Columbus. They don't have a huge bus system, but they have essential transportation for people getting food, for people to get dialysis, for people that want to go to church, that need the kinds of things in their lives that only public transit can help them to. I know many of my colleagues will do the same around the state. I look forward to hearing from witnesses about the potential for job growth and job creation, economic growth that these new provisions will unleash. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to our witnesses. Today's hearing is about the public transit component of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Mr. Chairman, thank you for pointing out the cooperative efforts that we engaged in. It appears to me the outcome worked out pretty well for you because there's a lot in the bill that I don't really agree with. As I've said repeatedly, we shouldn't pay for an infrastructure package by borrowing billions and billions more dollars, yet that's precisely what happened with this law. It authorized so much new spending that $118 billion had to be transferred from the Treasury's general fund to the Highway Trust Fund, which is supposed to pay for mass transit and highway construction with gas tax revenue. Now, some of my Democratic colleagues would make the Highway Trust Fund shortfall worse by suspending the federal gas tax, reasoning that the solution to high gas prices isn't more supply, but rather more debt. I'd suggest if we want to help commuters and families suffering from inflation, we can start by reversing the administration's actions, which keep us from using much of our own fossil energy. But back to infrastructure. Federal spending should be driven by a reasoned assessment of our nation's needs. However, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law seems to have been driven more by political imperatives. The bill funneled billions of dollars to projects that the private sector has been more than willing to fund, such as ferries and electric vehicle charging stations. Transit was given $108.1 billion over a 5-year period. To put that number into perspective, it's almost twice what transit got in the last surface transportation reauthorization. And this staggering sum will be on top of the nearly $85 billion given to transit, the vast majority of it characterized as emergency spending, to offset COVID losses from March 20th to March 21, just 1 year. In fact, this nearly $85 billion in funding that the federal government gave to transit agencies exceeded both the annual operating and capital costs of all the transit agencies in the United States combined in 2019. And at the time, my Democratic colleagues tried to justify paying for more than 100% of transit agencies' budgets by saying that transit systems could collapse from declines in ridership and state and local tax revenue. But as we know, state and local tax collections set a new record in 2020. And despite an all-time record amount of revenue collected by state and local governments, Congress gave more than $850 billion to state and local governments. Worse, billions of dollars will go to transit agencies that were facing ridership challenges well before COVID. Since reaching a high of 10.7 billion trips in 2014, transit ridership has steadily fallen. Fell by almost 8% in 2019. The last 2 years saw even steeper declines. Ridership fell at some agencies by over 70%. Some estimates predict that ridership will never fully return to pre-pandemic levels. Agency leaders in New York, Pittsburgh, and Washington, D.C. have all said many of the riders won't return. So why give away still more taxpayer money to agencies serving fewer riders? Well, a number of advocates suggest the solution to falling ridership is fare free transit. Advocates claim this will increase ridership and on-time performance, achieve social equity, reduce operator assaults and fare evasion. I suppose one way to reduce fare evasion, which is really theft of services, is to never charge a price in the first place. But as Milton Friedman helped to publicize, there's no such thing as a free lunch. In my view, just as car owners pay a federal gas tax to support highways, transit riders should have to pay something to contribute their fair share too, as should local communities. Transit systems, after all, serve a city or a metropolitan area, not the entire country. That's why Congress has traditionally helped to pay for capital needs, but not operating expenses. In New York or Washington, D.C., if New York or Washington, D.C. cannot or will not pay for their transit systems, why should federal taxpayers? And there's one other issue we must discuss, and that's the rising rate of crime in mass transit systems. Despite having far fewer riders, New York, L.A., Chicago, Philadelphia have all seen spikes in transit crime. There were 461 felony assaults on New York's Metropolitan Transportation Authority last year. That's the highest number since 1997. MTA riders are confronting fearful conditions. We've seen the news stories: hammer attacks, stabbings, multiple people pushed onto subway tracks, including in front of oncoming trains, with one woman tragically killed. Even New York City's mayor, a former cop, says he doesn't feel safe on the subway. Today we'll hear from two witnesses on the ongoing systemic challenges facing transit agencies that were not addressed in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Dr. Dorothy Scholes, a retired transit police captain, will testify that transit systems must address security issues that are putting rider safety at risk. And Randall O'Toole of the Thoreau Institute will testify about the long-term decline in ridership that began well before COVID. We've seen time and again that throwing extraordinary sums of taxpayer monies without serious reforms encourages transit systems to maintain the status quo. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and discussing the question, does mass transit continue to make sense in every U.S. city at its current scale? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Toomey. I'll introduce today's witnesses. Ms. Joanna Pinkerton is President and CEO of the Central Ohio Transit Authority, serving the Columbus region. Ms. Pinkerton's a licensed professional engineer with a history of implementing solutions to capitalize on Ohio's rich legacy of transportation, manufacturing, and technical resources. Ms. Pinkerton joined COTA in April 2018. Welcome. Senator Ossoff will introduce Mr. Greenwood, and I believe that Senator Warnock will have some comments later. He had a scheduling conflict, but will join us later. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to welcome Mr. Colley Greenwood to the Senate and to the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. I want to take a moment, Mr. Chairman, and acknowledge the tragic passing of MARTA CEO and General Manager Jeffrey Parker, who passed away this January. Jeff championed MARTA. He championed accessible public transportation in the state of Georgia. He created an expansive vision for transit in Metro Atlanta. He leaves a tremendous legacy that Colley now will continue. And though Jeff is no longer with us, his work and his vision are sustained and alive with us. And we will work together to realize as much of it as we can. And if I might, Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the committee and the Senate, extend our condolences to the whole MARTA family during this difficult time. Following Mr. Parker's passing in January, Mr. Greenwood was selected as MARTA's interim CEO and general manager. He brings more than 30 years of experience in transit. He served as chief service officer at North America's third largest transit system, the Toronto Transit Commission, overseeing bus, rail, accessible transit, station services, transit security, and maintenance. And in this interim role, Mr. Greenwood will now carry the torch forward from Mr. Parker to lead the largest and most ambitious expansion and modernization program since MARTA's founding over 40 years ago, an expansion and modernization that would not be possible without this committee and your support, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Greenwood, welcome to the Senate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Greg Regan is president of the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. He's the elected president of the Transportation Trades Department, a labor organization consisting of 36 unions that represent workers in all areas of transportation. He collaborates with TDD's affiliated unions to fight for long-term investment in transportation. He works to ensure transportation jobs are safe and secure and to protect the rights working people have to a union voice. Dr. Dorothy Moses Scholes is joining us remotely. She's an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute Policy and Public Safety Initiative. She's a professor emerita, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She was the first woman captain in the Metro North Commuter Railroad Police Department. Mr. Randall Toole is joining us remotely as director of the Thoreau Institute. He previously was a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, specializing in land use and transportation issues. Ms. Pinkerton, please begin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chair Brown, and also members of the committee today. I appreciate the opportunity to testify here on the enormous opportunities that we see in Central Ohio under this bipartisan infrastructure law. As previously mentioned, the legislation represents a long overdue commitment to repairing our transportation networks, and I believe repurposing them for a future economy in ways that we may not even realize yet. It addresses many of the ill effects that we are seeing, everything from congestion to pollution, even intentionally dividing communities in our historical past. And our transportation networks have not kept pace with the rapidly evolving changes in how we live, how we work, how we do business. And they do not yet account for changes in lifestyle, in American lifestyle, including comments that have been made about declining ridership. I think there are existing advancements in new technology on the horizon, which will have a direct impact and can move goods and people in a different way. With the new infrastructure funding, we can actually begin to shift our old ways of thinking to fix this. Ohio's 2 senators played a central role in drafting this transformative legislation through listening at the local level and raising awareness of the necessary investment needed to support our nation's economy at this time. So I'd like to share a few examples of how the Central Ohio Transit Authority can put these funds to use for the economy in Central Ohio and the entire state. Central Ohio is a region of approximately 2.2 million people with a unique situation where we're expected to grow to 3 million very soon. We have known through smart growth and planning principles, transit can build communities which lead to a higher quality of life, built around affordable housing, equitable access to amenities, and employment and job opportunities. Our transformational Link Us initiative is exactly that. Entities across our entire Central Ohio region are collaborating on Link Us to address our growth in a more sustainable future pattern through high-capacity, high-frequent transit corridors, which will support more dense transit-oriented development, and also connecting to our rural communities through highway and surface transportation investments. 2 of our planned corridors are already in the capital investment grant funding pipeline at the FTA. A 3rd corridor will be submitted later this year, and an expectation of 2 more to follow. We worked diligently to align these projects with the outcomes expected in the CIG program as written, and we expect that Link Us will benefit greatly from the infrastructure bill's improvements, specifically to the small starts portion of that program, which addresses communities of our size. At COTA, we also understand and take seriously our role in protecting lives through improving air quality in our region. Our industry knows that to have a lasting impact, we must commit operations to converting transit vehicles to clean fuel. At COTA, we're already on track to be completely diesel-free by 2025. That's a commitment we've made in the past with our local capital programs. And we're preparing a path forward to net carbon neutral. Last year, with the help of the federal Low-No grant program, we proudly first deployed our first electric transit vehicles, and we went a step further with our local energy providers to ensure that they're going to be powered by entirely renewable energy. The FTA just announced last week more than $1 billion in competitive funding to assist us and my colleagues with other ways to accelerate what we're already doing at the local level with our local funding. On a workforce front, I think this is important to mention. Our frontline operators in our fixed route, our paratransit, and our microtransit are essential to our mission. The transit industry is facing a workforce shortage like every other sector of the American economy. At COTA, we did not lay off a single transit operator during the pandemic, yet the current labor shortage has forced us to make service reductions. We are short almost 20% of the operators necessary to operate our fixed route service alone, putting a burden on our community, and as mentioned before, the need for frontline workers, third shift, late night service, weekend service to be served. We are working on innovative recruiting and training programs, and we encourage any workforce retraining funds to be available to transit agencies to make sure that we scale up, retool, and reimagine the workforce of the future. I'd like to mention that this law will not only improve the condition of transit agencies, it will improve the condition of the roadways that we run on. And I believe it can transform how we use them. It has the potential to dramatically improve safety and increase capacity using our existing system when it is repurposed by using more density shared rides. In Central Ohio, most of our road capacity can actually meet our future demand if we invest in emerging technology, connected vehicles, and I believe that the shared vehicle environment has the potential to make us both safer and more efficient. Our vehicle systems are increasingly generating more and more technology, more than 1 terabyte a day. And this is a huge opportunity now that we can fund software and technology improvements through infrastructure. We're not just funding the concrete and the steel and the roads and the vehicles anymore. We're funding the systems that can connect them. We believe in Central Ohio, we bring a unique approach to serving our region. Our mission is to connect people to prosperity through innovation, dedication, and teamwork. We are one of the few transit agencies that has seen an increase in ridership year over year prior to the pandemic because we understand that transit has to meet the needs of the economy and the people it is serving in the ways that they're changing. We think this bill has made huge and generous strides, but it is up to us from a policy and administration and regulatory perspective to authorize how we can reinvest and reimagine those systems through the policy applications. I believe the future work trends are here already, and we have generations of workers who are ready to join the workforce in Central Ohio through new systems invested in by this infrastructure bill. And we want to make sure that we have the American lifestyle, and quite frankly, this isn't something that a transit CEO says very often, but I threw it in there, the pursuit of happiness of the American lifestyle. My community is going through a huge transformation at the moment, and we believe that this infrastructure bill can help support us to make sure we support a future economy. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Pinkerton. Mr. Greenwood, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey, and distinguished members of the committee. I am Colley Greenwood, Interim General Manager and CEO of the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Agency in Atlanta, known as MARTA. I am honored to have the opportunity to appear alongside my transit agency colleagues and share our experience at MARTA and future expansion efforts made possible in part by the Congress's passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Serving MARTA in this role has been the culmination for me of 35 years of experience in the transit industry. I worked my way through college as a transit bus operator. At first, it was just a job that paid the bills. But at some point, the mission of getting people where they needed to go became a part of me. I rose to Chief Service Officer at the Toronto Transit Commission, and I guided that agency through several transformational initiatives. In 2019, I was personally recruited by MARTA's former CEO, Jeff Parker, because of the alignment of our vision for public transit. Jeff spoke about it as lines and dots, the lines being the transit and the dots being the communities and places that we serve. MARTA is the largest public transit agency in the Southeast and one of the largest in the country, providing bus, heavy rail, paratransit, and streetcar services. And it has a robust transit-oriented development program that incorporates affordable housing and equitable access, driving economic growth and development around our rail stations. We have eagerly embarked on 3 expansion projects that I'll briefly describe today, as we hope that they will be direct beneficiaries of funding and policy changes made possible by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. These expansion projects will benefit from a key change to the Small Starts program. which, as you know, increases project eligibility from $300 million to $400 million. And I'd like to personally thank Senators Warnock and Ossoff for their leadership on securing that change that is already having an impact for MARTA. One of the first initiatives I worked on when I arrived at MARTA was a series of improvements to bus amenities and a focus on bus service enhancements and expansion. As a former bus operator, I understand the importance of reliable bus service and that while rail may get most of the attention, it's the bus that is the backbone of public transit, and bus service, particularly bus rapid transit, has the potential to be transformative for a community. With that in mind, I am pleased to share that the Clayton South Lake Bus Rapid Transit Project has advanced to the project development phase of the Small Starts program. The estimated $338 million project will provide high-capacity transit service connecting College Park Rail Station in the southern part of Metro Atlanta that is close to the airport to several key destinations in Clayton County, including major commercial corridors, the hospital, and the City of Riverdale Town Center. As the first BRT in Clayton County, the project will feature 13 new branded stations with off-board fare collection, 10 branded electric vehicles and associated charging infrastructure, and the installation of transit signal priority equipment at key intersections. Another one of MARTA's highest ridership bus routes is along Campbellton Road in southwest Atlanta. In partnership with the City of Atlanta, we are investing in high-capacity transit to improve connectivity, accessibility, and mobility along this important corridor. The transit and transit-oriented development investments planned for this vibrant part of the city will support the overall economic and community development sought by the established neighborhoods along the route. One of the exciting parts of bus rapid transit is the planned use of electric buses to travel through dense urban corridors, leaving no emissions and no noise in their wake. MARTA's first 6 zero-emission buses will reduce our fleet emissions by approximately 935 short tons of greenhouse gases, while also reducing harmful fine particle matter that is linked to a variety of health risks. The BIL's increase in funding for the new low no-emission bus grant program will help MARTA accelerate the transition of our fleet to zero-emission buses. We are also working with the City of Atlanta on the transformation of our largest and busiest train station, 5 Points, which sits at the heart of the city. MARTA will be seeking a RAISE grant and new discretionary grants to support the $150 million redevelopment of the station that is the intersection of 4 rail lines and transfer hub for dozens of intercity bus routes that serve major government and educational facilities, job centers, and Atlanta's vibrant arts and cultural scene. In closing, I want to thank you for the opportunity to present to the committee today. I'm very proud of the progress that we've made in the Atlanta region, including in very challenging circumstances while we continued to provide service during the ongoing pandemic. I'm grateful for the leadership of the Georgia Congressional Delegation and their role in the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Senators Ossoff and Warnock have provided steadfast support of MARTA and the communities that we serve. I'm confident that the passage of this monumental law will contribute to our sustained growth as we expand in cost-effective and practicable ways with great support from President Biden, U.S. DOT Secretary Buttigieg, and Federal Transit Administrator Nuria Fernandez. Thank you very much, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey, for this historic legislation and all that it will do for the people and communities of the Atlanta metro region.
Thank you, Mr. Greenwood. Mr. Regan, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, for inviting me to testify today about the historic and long overdue investments of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law made in America's public transportation, and most importantly, in its frontline workforce. I'm speaking today on behalf of 36 unions who collectively represent the majority of those workers. They include bus and rail transit operators, station agents, car cleaners, mechanics, and other frontline professionals. Today, we may hear from some who argue that investments in public transit are a waste of taxpayer dollars. We may hear that public transit only serves New York City while disregarding the millions of Americans in rural, small, and medium-sized cities who have always counted on public transit and who continue to count on it today. We may hear that the pandemic has doomed public transit. I want to be clear on one fact. Those claims are wrong. They are short-sighted, and they ignore the critical role of transit for millions of working people who rely on these services for most of their transportation needs. That is truer today than any time in our modern history. The American middle class has been under attack for decades while the wealthy continue to get wealthier. Nearly 2/3 of Americans now live paycheck to paycheck, and the pandemic placed even greater strain on their household budgets, which were already stretched thin to the point of cruelty in one of the richest nations on the planet. And now, because of historically high gas prices, your constituents will have to look their families in the eye while they decide whether to put gas in their car, food on their tables, pay their utilities, hire childcare, all while dealing with all the other pressures that unchecked corporate greed and rampant inequality and the erosion of worker rights have placed on their lives. Some might incorrectly respond by saying that the cost of gas is President Biden's fault. To those listening to this hearing at home, please know that these are disingenuous claims that are only meant to prey on your fears so that wealthy corporations and their allies in Congress can profit economically and politically while the American people work harder yet get poorer. I say all this to make one point. It would be a grave mistake to undermine the workers in this industry, the essential service they provide to commuters in urban and rural communities alike, and the pocketbooks of every single American by turning our back on the benefits delivered by public transit. There's only one solution to drive the pre-pandemic growth we saw in this industry: more service, better service, and the kind of real long-term vision delivered by President Biden, the members of this committee, and the bill. Not only did the bill make unprecedented investments in public transportation, it also included two of transportation labor's biggest priorities: to protect workers from assault and to create new, good jobs in clean transit. 2 years ago, TTD's past president, Larry Willis, testified before this committee about the horrific safety conditions faced by transit workers on the job every single day, a problem that has only grown worse during the pandemic, as has previously been noted. Thanks to the hard work of this committee, Senator Van Hollen, Transportation Labor, and the unwavering support of President Biden, we will finally be able to turn the tide and ensure safety for our workers. The bill included critical reforms that require, for the first time, that the Federal Transit Administration collect accurate data on transit workforce assaults, reform its Public Transportation Agency safety plan process to include worker voices and incorporate measures to reduce the risk of assault in every single transit system in this country, and update its national safety plan to address the risk of assault and other public health concerns. While we wait for these new safety requirements to be implemented, it is deeply painful to witness transit workers still facing the threat of assaults and other unsafe conditions that place them in harm's way at their workplace. Last week, I spoke with Administrator Fernandez and her team at the FTA, and I'm confident they're working as quickly as possible to ensure that no transit worker will ever again wake up wondering if today is the day that they wind up in the hospital or worse because their employers did not protect them. Second, the bill clearly illustrates that innovative new technologies and the creation and maintenance of good union jobs go hand in hand when good policy ties it together. Chair Brown fought to ensure that massive new investments in low or no emission vehicle program were tied to truly historic investments in the incumbent and future workforce. Specifically, the bill requires transit agencies to show the workforce impacts of the transition to zero emission buses, and it also addresses one of the largest existing skills gaps in this industry by providing millions of dedicated funding for workforce training. Tying workforce training, including labor management training programs and apprenticeships, to the adoption of new technologies will ensure a high-road labor model that provides good union jobs and is consistent with the Department of Transportation's new innovative principles, which make clear that workers will have a voice at the table in the adoption of new tech. Last week, the FTA issued its first funding opportunity for the revised Low and No program. Thanks to Senator Brown's clear vision for workers and FTA Administrator Fernandez's commitment to workforce training, the FTA will guarantee that the training needs of the transit maintenance workforce will keep pace with new technology. Their careers can grow along with the advancements in tech. We thank both of you for your important work on this truly historic issue, and it's a huge improvement for transit workers. Again, thank you both for having me, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Regan. Ms. Schultz is recognized from New York.
To me and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. Can you hear me? I'm showing is mute.
We can hear you perfectly, Dr. Schultz.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to skip over most of my resume. You heard it, and as you know, I was in policing, and I've worked as a consultant for a number of transit agencies, as well as done safety and security audits for the FTA. My testimony is on crime, decriminalization of fare evasion, and the effects of fare-free transit on public order. I'm very glad to follow Mr. Regan because I too am concerned with worker security, and I know that that's an issue for all the transit worker unions. Transit systems in many cities, I can name them quickly. I'm from New York, I talk fast. New York, Denver, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Seattle, and Portland, Oregon, amongst those, defunded police, replacing them with homeless outreach and mental health workers, and with ambassadors who, rather than issue fare evasion summonses, explain to fare beaters how to pay their fare. A recent study of 115 agencies found that 90% reported complaints about homeless riders. Most believe this has a negative effect on ridership and that it has increased during COVID when some systems lost more than 70% of their commuters. Amid this disorder, many stations have become de facto homeless shelters and drug injection sites. Systems are finding phenol smokers in restrooms and on buses and trains, raising security and health concerns for riders and especially for employees. Destinationless riders and thieves and grifters are not new to transit, but passively allowing them to remain is new. There must be greater steps to maintain public order in transit. This is reflected in the broken windows theory, curtailing little offenses before they become big offenses, whether on the street, in a mall, or in a transit facility. Broken windows policing has been incorrectly described as the opposite of community policing, one tough, the other soft. This is a false dichotomy. Assuring community viability isn't tough or soft. It's maintaining order to keep people safe and secure. And without it, we are threatening patrons and employees. Systems have also lessened their focus on fare evaders. They're responding to studies, many of the same cities I previously mentioned, so I won't provide a list, that indicate that young minority males are disproportionately cited for non-payment. None of the studies, though, speculate whether the different levels of citations indicate different levels of fare compliance. But to talk about fare enforcement may be obsolete. A case in Maryland and one currently on appeal in the state of Washington are challenging the whole concept of fare sweeps and whether demanding proof of payment is a search under the Fourth Amendment. If the Washington case is decided the same as the Maryland case, systems are likely to further curtail enforcement, effectively making transit free, even if fares are not officially eliminated. There are also advocates who would see nothing wrong with this. Fare-free transit used to be called free transit before people realized that someone, even if not the riders, would be paying for it. Advocates believe fare-free transit will increase equity and pollution. They rarely, if ever, discuss security. On March 1st, using ARPA funds, Boston embarked on a fare-free transit experiment on 3 bus lines. I hope they will include security in their surveys. We know bus riders are mostly lower-income women and that women increasingly work as bus operators. Their personal security must be paramount. In conclusion, transit systems have an obligation to provide a secure environment. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law does not do this in any way, although it does finally, as Mr. Regan indicated, provide for tracking of assaults on employees. Infrastructure improvements are vital, but so is assuring patrons and employees feel secure in the newer improved facilities. If transit boards continue to provide shelter to the unhoused or injection sites for drug users, riders who can afford to will find other modes of travel. And employees, as we heard, already in short supply, will find other places to work. I thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Schultz. Mr. O'Toole is recognized from Oregon.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm Randall O'Toole, and I'm a policy analyst with nearly 50 years of experience studying transportation and land use issues. Today, you've asked how public transit can progress under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. I'm afraid I have bad news. It can't and it won't. Public transit has been declining for more than a century. For most of that time, federal, state, and local governments have thrown increasing subsidies at transit aimed at reversing that decline. The results were a complete failure. Since Congress passed the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964, taxpayers have spent well over $1.5 trillion subsidizing transit, yet the number of transit trips taken per urban resident has fallen 40% from 61 in 1964 to just 37 in 2019, the lowest in recorded history. In 2019, transit carried less than 1% of all U.S. passenger travel. Americans didn't reject transit because of some automaker conspiracy or an irrational love affair with driving. They stopped riding transit because it is an inferior good. It is slower and more expensive than driving, and it doesn't go where most people want to go. In 2019, people could save money by driving instead of riding transit because average transit fares per passenger mile were 20% more than Americans spent per passenger mile driving their cars. On top of this, subsidies to transit were more than 100 times as much per passenger mile as subsidies to highways. Even if with those subsidies, University of Minnesota researchers estimate that in 2019, the average resident of one of the nation's 50 largest urban areas could reach almost twice as many jobs in a 20-minute auto drive as in a 60-minute transit trip. Transit is so inferior, researchers found, that bicycle riders can reach more jobs in 50 minutes or less than transit riders in trips of the same length. This makes transit third-class transportation. The researchers found transit was inferior even in New York City, the city with the best transit in America. The pandemic accelerated all the trends that led Americans to turn away from transit. Increased telecommuting, decentralization of downtown jobs, and movement of residences to the suburbs and exurbs. The Census Bureau's American Community Survey found that increased telecommuting led to the number of people driving alone, bicycling, or walking to work in 2020 to each decline by 16%, but the number commuting by transit fell by 41%, another sign of transit's inferiority. The transit industry claims that transit relieves congestion, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and helps low-income people out of poverty and promotes economic development. I've discussed all of these in my written testimony, but for now I would just like to address the claim that transit promotes social justice by helping poor people, and that free transit would be even more socially just. Even low-income people know that transit is inferior. In 2019, only 5% of workers who earn less than $25,000 a year took transit to work, compared with 7% of people who earn more than $75,000 a year. More than 3/4 of transit subsidies come from regressive taxes such as sales or property taxes. This means that 95% of low-income people who don't ride transit disproportionately pay taxes for transit systems that are disproportionately used by high-income people. That's the very definition of social injustice. I wonder if free transit advocates realize how racist they are when they argue that poor minorities should take third-class transportation while almost everyone else gets to take first-class transportation. American cities have a long history of throwing money at transit for no measurable benefits. The worst case is Los Angeles, which spent billions building rail transit and lost 5 bus riders for every rail rider it gained. Recently opened rail lines in Charlotte, Minneapolis, Portland, St. Louis, and other cities also produce no increase in riders. The only real beneficiaries of these projects are the engineering firms that designed them and the construction firms that built them. Transit agencies hope higher gas prices will encourage people to return to transit, but they won't. Between 1999 and 2011, gas prices nearly tripled after adjusting for inflation, yet ridership grew by only 12%. That won't be enough to offset the effects of increased telecommuting, decentralization of jobs and housing, and people's wariness of crime and infectious diseases associated with crowding. Transit's problem is not a shortage of funds, but too much money, which transit agencies spend at projects aimed at pleasing politicians, not improving transit ridership. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act only made this problem worse. If the federal government must subsidize transit, it should make subsidies proportional to the fare revenues collected by each transit agency. That will make transit agencies responsive to transit riders rather than to engineering and consulting and construction firms that have gotten fat spending federal transit dollars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Ms. Pinkerton, start with you. You talked about the population growth that we think is likely, maybe certain, in the Columbus region. Part of that growth obviously will result from Intel's $20 billion semiconductor plant in New Albany, 5,000 building trades workers over 10 years, ultimately creating 10,000 new jobs. We're burying the term Rust Belt in Ohio. How will CODA and the investments in the infrastructure bill contribute to that by helping more workers connect to jobs created by Intel and all of the spinoffs from Intel?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. Just last Friday, I was invited with former elected federal officials in the Ohio Business Roundtable who convened the local officials who are looking at the entire system. So when you have such massive investment, we're already seeing growth by hundreds of thousands in our community. You have to look at the entire system. It's a systems engineering problem. And so I'm really thrilled that CODA is invited to be at the table. And the topics last Friday were interesting. They weren't things that you would normally think of being the responsibility of a federal highway or a DOT or a transit agency, but it was about access, affordable housing, childcare, common themes like food access. And so we believe that mobility is the most important component of building out a new site, such as the Intel site. And when I say mobility, I mean physical and I mean digital. So people have to be able to move and they have to be able to connect. So we will be part of an overall system. We already know that you cannot expand the highways enough to relieve congestion and get all people to the site. We've already built 12 lanes out that direction. But reusing the number of lanes with more dense development and also the transit being part of the formula, CODA intends to use our Link Us initiative and make sure that we're looking at the new trends of people coming in and out of the city to the new site and where they're coming from across rural parts of Ohio as well, so that we can digitally connect the rural transit systems to our high-capacity systems. It doesn't mean we have to buy new vehicles. It means we have to upgrade the software and the hardware systems to make sure that they can talk to one another.
Thanks, Ms. Pinkerton. Mr. Greenwood, what does faster, better service mean to your riders?
To the riders, it means the world. It actually unlocks potential, unlocks opportunities for people who normally might not take transit. Having a more robust transit system that's more reliable, getting people to where they want to go sooner, actually allows them the dream of chasing the job that they want, living in the places that they want. And the aspect of reliability can't be overlooked. It's one thing to have a scheduled service, but quite another to be able to stick to it. When people give their word in their daily lives, it needs to mean something. And if they're relying on public transit, then we need to make sure that our word means something too. We only get that when we invest in transit, making sure that our infrastructure is such that that level of reliability is absolutely there.
Thanks. I think especially of low-income workers who don't have, frankly, much of a voice in this Congress, who work all day on their feet all day, then they have to take a bus ride home and change buses, and it takes an hour and 10 minutes to get home. And what better, more efficient service would mean to them. Thank you. Mr. Regan, the infrastructure law invests in both zero-emission buses and the workers who operate and maintain those next-generation buses. I've had conversations in Akron and Canton and Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati and probably 7 or 8 transit systems in Ohio about that transition. When companies and agencies adopt new technologies, workers often get left behind or denied the training that they need. Are the bipartisan infrastructure laws transit requirements a good model for including workers in technology transitions? Walk through how we avoid some of the problems we've seen in the past, especially when you think about diesel engines to all electric buses.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I think finally for the first time in our history, we're actually taking the right approach to workforce training when it comes to transit. Historically, we've spent less than 1% of expenditures at transit agencies on frontline worker training. This will put 5% of that into their overall investment in the people that are going to be operating these systems. And that's an important part. We're only going to meet the true promise of this moment, which is the real investment, if we're actually growing the workforce along with the expansion of our systems and improving service. The workforce has to be right along for the ride.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Toole, in recent years, the federal government was providing roughly $13 billion per year to subsidize transit. In 2020, they got their $13 billion, and then over the course of just that year, they got another $70 billion, 70, on top of the 13. With the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and recently passed Omnibus, transit agencies will get another $20.5 billion. And then on top of that, they'll get an additional $87 billion over the next 4 fiscal years. This, of course, doesn't include the hundreds and hundreds of billions that the federal government sent to state and local governments in a year when they were setting an all-time record for tax revenue collection. So my question for you, are you aware of any kind of logical, methodical process for determining, was it needs-based, or is there some other mechanism that you're aware of for determining these massive amounts of money?
No, I don't know of any reason why transit should have gotten all of that money. Transit before the pandemic was carrying less than 1% of passenger travel and no freight. Transit during the pandemic has been carrying less than 0.5% of passenger travel and no freight. The main transportation problem that emerged from the pandemic was a freight problem, the supply chain problem. And yet none of the COVID relief money went to aid that supply chain problem.
So,
by my calculation, about more than 40% of the money went to transit, of the transportation dollars went to transit.
So, the U.S. Department of Transportation has found that there's a backlog of $105.1 billion in deferred maintenance and replacement needs for mass transit. This is generally known as the state of good repair needs. Seems to me that there are project sponsors across the U.S. that are looking to have the federal government now fund the light rail, commuter rail, heavy rail projects amid depressed and uncertain ridership. Are these transit agencies all making sure that the money they're getting is first going to deal with the state of good repair, to bring up to date the deferred maintenance and the replacement needs that have been identified?
No, we have many examples of transit agencies that had serious deferred maintenance needs and chose to spend federal dollars on building new transit instead. There's the Silver Line in Washington, D.C. There's the Green Line in Boston. Many other examples of transit agencies with transit systems that were breaking down, deciding instead to spend money on new transit. I think what transit agencies have learned from the pandemic is that it doesn't matter if they actually carry any transit riders. They're still going to get lots of subsidies. And that's a lesson that's very bad. It tells people that the important thing is the jobs they create, the construction that's done. What's not important is whether anybody is actually carried by them. And so transit agencies have no incentive to be responsive to rider needs.
Let me turn to Dr. Scholes. As I mentioned in my opening statement, New York City Mayor Eric Adams has publicly admitted to not feeling safe using his own city's subway, the MTA. Earlier this year, New York District Attorney Alvin Bragg directed his staff to withhold prosecution of, quote, low-level, end quote, crimes like fare evasion. The previous DA, Cy Vance, announced ending criminal prosecution for fare evasion back in 2017. So we have some years now of experience where, as a sort of de facto matter, there's kind of a no fare ridership on the New York MTA. So at a minimum, it's actually been decriminalized as a practical matter. What's the experience been for the New York MTA? What lessons can be drawn from this history?
One of the lessons is, of course, this is also true in Brooklyn with D.A. Gonzalez, where it's been true for a long time. Manhattan always gets all the attention, but decriminalizing fare enforcement is nothing new in New York or anywhere. I believe the last thing I read in New York, which has barriers, turnstiles, fare evasion is up to 40%. So you can only imagine what it's like in systems like Minnesota, Seattle, Portland, that basically are barrier-free and have a sign saying, in effect, please remember to pay your fare. And that's where the decriminalization of the fare enforcement really comes into play, because particularly in these systems, the fare enforcement was really the only sign of order or order maintenance that existed. And if you do away with fare enforcement, it's not just the income from the fares, which a lot of advocates say, well, it's only 10% the fare box or 20%, although in some cities it is as high as 40%. But what it does is it takes away capable guardians. There's no reason for people who represent the system to be on the trains or on the platforms. Now systems are also going more and more to automated entry and ticket, which means that not only are there no police or security personnel, there are very few station agents, and so people are really left to their own devices on the system, and it discourages orderly behavior. It isn't only the $1.20 or the $2.75. It's if enough people see other people who aren't paying, they're going to feel, why should they pay? Why should anyone pay? And you lose control of the system. I think what New York learned is that it's sort of a cliche, no good deed goes unpunished. During the pandemic, because so many homeless people really had nowhere to go, and there were so few riders, it sort of looked the other way and let them be. Now, I don't want to single out homeless people. Many of them are victims. In New York, 2 or 3 have been killed on the transit system. But unfortunately, their presence discourages others and helps to create the sense that there is no order. And because for many of them, their behavior can't be predicted, it adds to the fear level. So all of these things together add to a downward spiral that is going to make people who don't have to depend on the system less likely to use it. And if people only have to go to work now 1 or 2 days a week instead of 5 days a week, I suspect that many of them won't get out of their pajamas, as the mayor asked them to, and they'll find other ways to get to their workplaces on the days that they do have to put on clothing.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Senator Tester from his office from Montana.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for having this hearing. I think it's very, very appropriate. I've got a number of questions. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Pinkerton. You talked about electric buses on your route. I think what percentage of vehicles are electric in your transit system?
Thank you for the question, Senator. We just launched our first 2 buses this year with another 8 to come, and then we intend to have a capital program where within 10 years, we would switch to primarily electric or with a mix of our compressed natural gas fleet. I previously mentioned our commitment to diesel-free by 2025. That will be achieved by entirely compressed natural gas and a mixture of EV coming into the fleet over the next 10 years.
So your 2 electric buses, and by the way, congratulations on that. The 2 electric buses that you have been on routes how long?
They have been in service since last fall, sir.
Since last fall. So we know the advantage, and I think it's been pointed out already. No emissions and noise issues are minimized in a big way. Can you talk about any other advantages you might have other than the fact that you can potentially run these off of renewable electricity? Are there any disadvantages?
Thank you for the question. I wouldn't consider it a disadvantage. I think it's an opportunity. I mentioned the retraining and retooling of our American workforce. I have worked in the automotive industry, the DOT, and we all saw the silver tsunami coming, and we saw the younger generation coming up. I see an opportunity for workforce retraining. As a matter of fact, we bring 17-year-olds from high school into our facility, and we started doing this before electric vehicles came online, working on the floor for half the day. In addition to taking their classes, they're paid a full wage while they're with us, and they're offered a job at the end of the 2-year training. But we are being incredibly aggressive with the opportunity not only to help the future workforce understand the electrification of transportation, but the electrification and security issues we have with the grid, and our lack of a national energy policy. Also, coding, technology, advanced technology systems. So I mentioned a car and a bus generate a terabyte of data a day. So understanding how those systems work. And one of the primary advantages we're going to see out of this are massive state of good repair improvements. I'm very fortunate. I do not have issues with state of good repair. We have significant local funding at the Central Ohio Transit Authority that ensures we are in a state of good repair at all times. But in order to do that, you have to have the data and the analytics to shift to a predictive maintenance model. We don't wait for something to break down. We predict when it's going to break down, and we fix it before it happens. And so that shift to data and analytics, I think, is a huge opportunity for us.
Thank you. Mr. Greenwood, this next question is for you because I've had a request to ask you a question, but this is my question, not the requesters. For your work with MARTA, you're coordinating with the Federal Transit Administration, the state of Georgia, county governments, and of course, the city of Atlanta. That is a lot of layers for you to deal with, and I'm sure a lot of administrative headaches. While not on the same scale, I hear from Montanans about the amount of time that is required for reporting transit projects, even routine operation. So, Mr. Green, could you speak a little bit about how your organization navigates these requirements? And do you see areas where it might make sense to take a different approach to some of the administrative requirements?
Thank you for the question. We actually enjoy a good partnership with our state and city representatives. We are galvanized by the urgency of good, connective public transit. While there may be issues administratively to be hammered out, as a lot of the legislation, a lot of the grant opportunities are new, we meet quite regularly and have a deep internal commitment between the groups that we're going to sit at the table, strategize, and make sure that the winner in all of this is public transit and the communities and individuals that depend on it.
Thank you for that. I'll just close with a comment. I live 12 miles west from a town of a population of 600. We don't have a lot of transit there. So when I came to Washington, D.C., and I had the opportunity to ride the Metro, I was pleasantly surprised. You pay to get on the Metro. And I can tell you that it cost me more money to back my car out onto the street than it does to get a ride on the Metro. So to say that driving a car is cheaper than driving transit or paying for transit, that's using some pretty funny math. With that, I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized from her office.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks. It's great to be with you. Let me just ask this. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill has provisions that extend Build America, Buy America requirements for infrastructure programs, two infrastructure programs that currently don't have them. And this means more jobs with more benefits for American workers in Minnesota, including in Minnesota's taconite industry or for Minnesota's bus manufacturers. So, Mr. Regan, let me ask you about this. Can you speak to the importance of the Buy America provisions in the infrastructure bill, and what do you expect that effect to be for American manufacturing?
Thank you, Senator. I think the Buy American provisions are vitally important to the long-term success of the investments we're making here. In particular, we have emerging new rolling stop opportunities and new technology that's going to be part of the system, including on EV side. That's an emerging marketplace. And there's an opportunity with the right policies to make sure that we can recapture some of that manufacturing capability that we've lost over the past and we've frankly given away. So Buy America combined with other investments into the U.S. economy will really go a long way to making sure that, A, we have a functioning system, we have the workforce that can provide it, and we have the supply chain here in the United States to supply our systems with all of the buses, rolling stock that they need.
Right. I totally agree with that. You know, in Minnesota's Iron Range is a major supplier of American iron ore, which is why we care so much about Buy American standards that are focused on melted and poured in the United States. And I would, of course, representing the Iron Range, add mining to that. For the steel workers and others that are working on Minnesota's Iron Range, this is absolutely essential. So talk a little bit more about why these more detailed standards and also addressing the many waivers that are often had been granted in the past, why this is so important and how it addresses our competitiveness as a country as well as our ability to build out our manufacturing.
Yeah, you know, the Buy America and the way it's been applied has always been slightly imperfect because you're doing it based on a percentage of the rail car. So if it's 60% previously, go up to 75%. Everyone can assign their own value based on how much the chassis truly made up of this car or how much the aluminum shells were, things like that. So having more detail and more specificity with our Buy America policies is really important. And also having just more data to understand where the gaps are within our own supply chain so that we can meet those needs, so that manufacturers can find the opportunities to make something that can go into these rail cars. And so that the people that you represent up in Minnesota can know where there are going to be an opportunity to try to build something for this country and with the money that we're investing into transportation.
Right, and exactly. Those businesses that are assessing where they want to put their investment dollars will have a better understanding of where they're going to be able to get a long-term return. And those workers are going to know better where they can expect to really build a career. And all of that, it seems to me, is contributing to our competitiveness as a country. And also to the long-term resilience of our supply chains. And I think at the end of the day, it also can contribute to the affordability of the products that Americans are buying. Would you agree?
I would completely agree with that. And I think it would, the more we invest in manufacturing and actually having domestic supply chain, the cheaper it's going to be, the more we can actually compete around the world, frankly. And, you know, if the supply chain crisis that we lived through over the past year has showed us anything, is that in many areas, we just simply are not prepared to deal with and to provide some of the goods that we need in this country. Rail chassis was a huge example of that. We just didn't make them here. We didn't have enough here. We might have the rail cars ready to move. We might have the trucks to transport it. We didn't have the chassis. And that just shows that we are unprepared for a moment like that.
Right, exactly. Mr. Greenwood, let me quickly turn to you. I just have a couple more seconds. People who rely on transit, and this are millions of Americans who use transit to get to work, to school, to get to the doctor's office, to get to childcare. They understand kind of this truism that if you care about opportunity, if you care about equity, you care about buses. You can't really have one without the other. And so I'm interested in your perspective on this as you think about running an important organization like MARTA. What do you do? How do you think about this need to really make sure that that system is working, that it's well run, that it's on time, that it works for the people that rely on it to make their lives work?
It's integral in our daily lives as MARTA employees, unionized employees, frontline employees, management right through and through. We have this commitment that our job is to move people. And I would go one step further and say public transit is important even if you don't ride the bus and if you don't ride the train. This pandemic showed us that the employees that we call essential employees, they've been essential all along. We've just decided to start calling them that through the pandemic. But they went to work at the hospitals, at the medical centers, at the facilities that created the PPE, and they continued working, and they got there by and large via transit. So the beneficiaries of public transit go beyond the people that actually step on the vehicles.
Well said. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Ossoff from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in addition to you, Mr. Greenwood, I want to welcome the members of MARTA's board in attendance, and building on my colleague Senator Smith's praise of the workers who sustain these transit systems, I want to recognize Britt Dunham's ATU Local 732 and thank all of the transit workers in Georgia for their efforts. Mr. Greenwood, I want to begin by discussing expansion of transit service to Clayton County. And Clayton County joined MARTA in 2014. And as you know, I'm continuing to urge the expansion of high-capacity service to Clayton County. Will the bipartisan infrastructure law that we passed in Congress help provide MARTA with the resources and the capacity to extend that service into Clayton County?
It absolutely will. That is our commitment. The bipartisan infrastructure law will deliver resources necessary for high-capacity transit. We acknowledge, an existing challenge in making sure that expanding rail anywhere in Metro Atlanta is difficult. We do have to, have a lot of collaboration with our partners and cooperation with the Class 1 railroads who, they have different priorities and they are perhaps less incentivized to move people as we are. However, we will continue those conversations and those discussions, and we are reassured by the fact that we can successfully do high capacity transit with our BRT systems. We're pursuing that right now in Clayton County, and we're also investigating bus rapid transit in Campbellton on Campbellton Road in Southwest Atlanta, as well as Clifton Corridor in Northeast Atlanta.
So, Mr. Greenwood, can you give an estimate for when Clayton County residents may be able to take advantage of that planned BRT system, which will be made possible in part thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law?
Well, the good news is based on the support of the BIL, residents in Clayton County can start to expect results as early as 2026. So our South Lake BRT will come online in 2026. The operations and maintenance facility to support that will come online in 2026. And what that means is it really unlocks transit as a force multiplier. The sooner we get these projects out of the ground and in running, in situational running, the sooner the beneficiaries can start to improve their lives and contribute to the economic development that we boast about.
Thank you, Mr. Greenwood. And you mentioned in your opening remarks the 5-point station. And MARTA is providing service across the Metro Atlanta region, Mr. Chairman, Lovejoy, Riverdale, College Park, East Point, Decatur, all the way up to Sandy Springs, Dunwoody, and Alpharetta. 5-point station is the hub. And I want to urge you, Mr. Greenwood, to submit that application for the resources to help upgrade that facility, particularly with a view toward increasing capacity and passenger safety, and commit to you that I will do everything I can working with Secretary Buttigieg to see to it that we can upgrade the 5-point station, the hub of MARTA's heavy rail system, and ensure that it is the safest and best hub possible for riders in Metro Atlanta.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff.
Thank you. Look forward to working with you on that. Finally, Mr. Greenwood, I want to ask you about planning. And, the President signed my Local Transit Planning Support Act into law as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which expands support for transit planning in low-income communities and in low-density communities. Can you please comment on how the Local Transit Planning Support Act will improve transportation around Metro Atlanta, but also based upon your experience for coastal Georgia, for North Georgia, for Middle Georgia, for South Georgia, where there's not as robust an existing infrastructure as there is around Metro Atlanta?
Yeah, I can say, thank you for the question. I can say that, MARTA enjoys a 1 cent sales tax through the communities that it serves in Fulton, including the city of Atlanta and the adjacent communities. Some of our communities outside of MARTA's footprint, one of the common complaints that we hear is that transit isn't expanding fast enough, and it's not going to the places that are developing around the current MARTA footprint. And so that legislation will enable some of the agencies that don't have as much funding, don't have the formula available to do that kind of investigation. It will allow them to catch up. It will allow them to do the work necessary to actually create linkages with MARTA and better serve the region through a considered and interconnected network.
And with the chairman's indulgence, for parts of Georgia outside of your immediate jurisdiction, for folks along the coast, South Georgia, Middle Georgia, North Georgia, Local Transit Planning Support Act will help low-density communities to plan their transportation systems based upon your broad experience, 35 years working in transportation. How can that law impact and improve transportation for communities across the state?
I have always looked at transit as the common thread that weaves through the fabric of any nation that it serves. And there's no point in building strong transit in one area and leaving the rest, the neighboring agencies, desolate. So transit is, we call it the equalizer because it gets you from point A to point B and from point B to point A. So that is, regardless of where you live, that currency, that equity is available for you. And so that's the magic of transit, is that it is a common thread through all the communities that it serves, and will be better able to link with the other providers of transit in that common goal.
Thank you, Mr. Greenwood.
Thanks,
Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Russell. Senator Menendez from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I know you have many topics before you, and I appreciate it. As my colleagues have heard me say many times over, we have a program in the Northeast Corridor called the Gateway Program to modernize our century-old infrastructure between New Jersey and New York that is utilized by both New Jersey Transit, Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, some of the New York transit entities, and it's absolutely vital to the future of my state, the Northeast Corridor, and our national economy. And I say the national economy because that region generates 20% of GDP for the entire nation. And this section is incredibly important. I'm happy to report that we've made significant progress on Gateway over the last year or so. The Portal North Bridge project signed a full funding agreement with the Federal Transit Administration in January of last year. That has allowed over $800 million in federal funding to begin to flow to the project. And the Hudson River tunnels that had been stalled for years under the previous administration are moving again. Last year, the Biden administration finalized the environmental review projects, and within the last few weeks, the project received an improved rating from FTA that allow it to move forward under the Capital Investment Grants, or the SIG program. And that's why I raised this, because I want to talk a little bit about SIG as part of our effort. But before that, I want to thank the chairman and other colleagues on the committee for their work to pass a strong transit title as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that increased the authorization for the SIG program by 50%. Last week, we passed the final FY22 spending bill that included an additional $400 million for SIG, and when combined with direct appropriations, it essentially amounts to a doubling of SIG from FY21 to 22. So I'd like to ask Ms. Pinkerton and Mr. Greenwood, both of your transit systems have small start projects in the SIG pipeline. Can you speak about the importance of the SIG program to your respective agencies and the communities that they serve?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Our Small Starts Capital Improvement Grant applications do fall under a regional growth initiative locally that we've really put a lot of thought into over the last 5 to 10 years, where we understand the rapid growth, the addition of 1 million more people to our region could cause housing to increase and become unaffordable. We're seeing that realized today. And we're also seeing that the amount of infrastructure that would need to be invested could cost billions. But if we build in a smaller footprint, in a more transit-oriented development manner, then we have the ability to actually reduce the tax burden on our local residents. That will require investment in transit in an order of magnitude we've not done before in the Central Ohio region. So the CIG program is absolutely essential to us as we transform our community from a small city into a metropolitan area. And I need to mention that in particular, the policy changes around the small starts portion has been vital for communities of ours who have gone from a mid-sized city to a large city status just in the last census.
Mr. Greenwood, want to add anything to that?
Similarly, I would say that the improvement through the CIG of really changing our ceiling from $300 million to $400 million has really unlocked the ability for MARTA in particular to move a lot more projects through the pipeline. So we've gotten ourselves into a position where through a more agile administrative landscape, we're able to execute on multiple projects at the same time, bringing to the communities, the sense of soon certain positive results, as opposed to a landscape that normally causes people to hear about something and then wait and wait for results. They're able to get a timeline that is more in keeping with their expectations, and it allows us to more aggressively move through the process.
And I assume you both believe that Congress should fully fund the federal share of these eligible products. Is that a fair statement?
We do.
One last question. I'm a former mayor, and I have seen firsthand the transformative impact that access to well-planned transit can have on communities. I've long worked to provide additional resources to strengthen the linkage between affordable housing and access to transit. I'm pleased that some progress was made at that front in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, providing greater focus on transportation planning activities, including what I call livable communities, or the effort of transit villages, and putting it all together in terms of infrastructure. I appreciate have worked with this on the chairman in the past. Can you speak to the ways in which your agencies have worked or are working to incorporate access to affordable housing when developing and evaluating the impacts of a potential project?
If I may begin, at MARTA, that has been a staple of our development. We talk about lines and dots and making sure that not only do we build the community through effective corridor planning, but making sure that the dots, the stations, the areas around those stations are well supported. We firmly believe that equitable transit-oriented development is essential to the development of a community. When we speak about economic development, the intention is for people that live in the community to be able to share and contribute to that economic development. We also know that, in families where rental income or rental rates are difficult, it's often the case that people are moving, changing locations in order to find housing that they can afford. And the domino effect of that, of course, is that the children that are established in school and trying to, demonstrate their own academic prowess end up having to change schools and relocate themselves and start over again. So we're affecting more than just, the immediate members of the family that we see getting on the trains. We're affecting the entire family. So equitable transit-oriented development forces communities not forces, but enables communities to work together to plan deliberately to protect the interests of everyone.
Thank you for your insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. Senator Warnock from Georgia is recognized. I shared with Mr. Greenwood and his staff from MARTA prior to the hearing the good work you did in helping to build a strong transit title. So you're recognized. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, and it's wonderful to be a part of this hearing on public transportation and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I often say that physical mobility and social mobility are inextricably connected. People need to be able to get where they're going to get where they're going. And so this is important work. And I'm particularly proud that Mr. Colley Greenwood is here representing MARTA. which services the metro Atlanta area. Georgia has more than 15 urban transit systems and 80 rural systems, serving nearly 80% of our 159 counties from Augusta to Valdosta. Georgia Transit and MARTA's expansion plan has been top of mind for me since my first day here in the Senate, especially as we negotiated the bipartisan infrastructure package. I agree with my colleagues who've talked about the importance of CIG, and I was proud to introduce the Capital Investment Grant Improvement Act and fought to ensure that its provisions were included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I want to talk specifically about MARTA's work in Clayton County. Georgia creates jobs, provides commuters with more affordable mobility options. Again, mobility leads to social mobility, bolstering the local economy. And that's why I was thrilled to deliver a 1-2 punch of funding last week for MARTA's new multi-purpose operations and maintenance facility in Clayton County. I fought all year to include funding for critical Georgia projects in our annual funding package, and last week we passed it into law. Good news, including the $5 million I secured for MARTA's new facility. I also learned last week that MARTA will receive $15 million for that same facility through the federal buses and bus facilities competitive grant program. And I was proud to write in support of MARTA's application and glad that we were able to deliver on both fronts. Mr. Greenwood, could you tell me a little about the importance of this facility to MARTA and to Clayton County?
Thank you, Senator Warnock. And we collectively at MARTA have been celebrating the good news and singing your praises and Senator Ossoff's praises just very recently about all the work that you've done to support us in this regard. The Clayton Operations and Maintenance Facility specifically is very important to the neighborhood as well as it is to our system. It is a bricks and mortar representation to the people in the community that MARTA is not just passing through. We're living here. And it's a representation to the people in the community that, yes, there are going to be 733 permanent jobs, direct and indirect, as a result of this facility being in the neighborhood. And they are jobs in operations, administration, technology, leadership and management. It's an inspiration to the community. We'll have a local MPD, MARTA Police Department precinct right there in the neighborhood. It provides all at once economic development, addresses climate change because of its green leanings, safety and security in the neighborhood, equity, pride, and inspiration in a neighborhood, and a clear example of capital investment leading to operational efficiencies in that as we minimize non-productive, what I call deadhead miles and minutes, that is time that the vehicle is not in revenue service because the home is now inside of the community. So for all those reasons, the Clayton O&M facility is firing on all cylinders.
And all of those are wonderful developments and benefits to this work. You touched on its impact on the issue of the climate and sustainability. Can you say a little bit more about how this facility impacts your effort to transition more of your bus fleet to electric?
Sure, thank you. I will say this, it's a purpose-built facility, and that means that we are yes, we're solving today's needs in terms of how many buses will you move in there and how will they be distributed throughout the system, but we're keenly aware of the fact that we will, it's incumbent on us to support today's propulsion needs and tomorrow's propulsion discoveries. We're aware that at this, it's 2022 and the technology in varying zero-emission propulsion systems is changing rapidly, and so we're making sure that this facility allows us to remain nimble, allows us to accommodate what we know about electric buses today and accommodate tomorrow the emergent developments in the future propulsion technologies. So we'll have space, we'll have ports, we'll have roof mount access for the batteries, we'll have hoists, smart hoists and charging. We'll have safety and minimal reversal moves built into the design of the system of the facility. So it's what we need today, but it's absolutely forward-facing in a green landscape.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Greenwood, focused on green opportunities in this work. Glad that I was able to secure $20 million for this facility. Hopefully we can secure future investments, and I look forward to seeing this project once it's completed.
Thank you, Senator Warnock.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warnock. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony and your work. The passage of the Infrastructure Modernization Bill is going to be a huge boost to transit in my state of Maryland. It's going to allow us to modernize our existing transit systems, build new light rail systems. It will extend the federal participation in our nation's metro system, here the WMATA system in Washington region, and it will revive a chance for Baltimore to build a full metro system, which was called the Red Line, where the federal delegation had secured about $1 billion in federal support, but the state a number of years ago decided not to put the matching fund in, the governor at that time. So we think we'll get that back on the list of things to do. I'd like to focus briefly on an overlooked area of transit, but one where we made substantial progress as part of the Infrastructure Modernization Bill, and that's transit worker safety and workforce development and training. And Mr. Regan, thank you and your team at the Transportation Trades Department for your input on the bill, especially those provisions. I want to start with the safety issue because I introduced a bill to support greater worker safety in response to all of the assaults that we've witnessed on our transit workers, which predated the pandemic but really came to a peak during the pandemic. And there was no sort of definition for what constituted one of these attacks. There was no record keeping, and there was no system in place for preventing these avoidable attacks. I'm pleased that we were able to include provisions from that bill in the final product. Thank you for your support. Can you just talk about the implementation of those safety provisions and why they're important and how we can make quick progress?
Of course. And first of all, thank you for your leadership on this issue. It was vital to getting us across the finish line. This has been shockingly hard to get accomplished over the years. So for us to have this finally in law is a really major win for working people. To your point, under the current definition of assault, somebody could have their nose broken while they're driving a bus and that not count as a federal assault. So we need to make sure that the rules and the reporting requirements are definitely upgraded and accurately reflect the scale of the problem as we see it. The other thing that I think one of the most important aspects of what this bill does is it brings the workers into the safety planning process, it seems so obvious. These are the people who are seeing this, seeing what it's like on the ground. They're the ones who are dealing with, dealing with the assaults, are the ones who know where the vulnerabilities are, and they should be at the table when they're talking to their agencies about planning for how to make a safer environment for both passengers and for the employees. So that's going to be a really big step for us towards hopefully solving this awful problem.
Well, I look forward to working with you on the implementation phase. As you know, passing a law is one thing, implementing it is another. So we want to make sure that those changes take place as rapidly as possible for the safety of the workers. Another often overlooked area has been workforce training for transit operators and workers. I'd also introduced legislation on that. I was pleased that the FTA also moved forward about the same time with a National Transit Workforce Center, and that received additional funds as part of the infrastructure bill. Can you talk about implementation of that provision of the legislation?
Yeah, well, first of all, this is the first time we're actually putting federal funding into frontline transit workforce training, which is a huge improvement, something that is frankly long overdue. And the funds in the Infrastructure Act will actually help us jumpstart that in a much more important way, and not at a moment too soon, because if my friends over here are going to be expanding service and seeing new opportunities to grow transit systems, we need to have the workers there that are ready to operate all of this. So we're looking forward to working together with agencies and with our partners in the industry, that when we're going in there to apply for funds, when people are saying, hey, FTA, this is what we plan to do with this money, here's where we want to use X billions of dollars. Well, let's partner with that to make sure that the workforce development, and these are the jobs we're going to create. These are how we're going to train people up. These are the new skills we're going to develop for our employees. That's going to be a really important part of making this a success across the country.
No, I appreciate that, because we often focus on the hardware of our transit systems, right? Buses, metro cars, rails, trains, which we have to do. But of course, they require a trained workforce, and we want to make sure that workforce is safe as they go about their job. So thank you for your work on this. It did take longer than it should have, but I'm glad we were able to include those provisions in the final bill. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Thank you to the 5 witnesses for joining us today, the 2 from New York and Oregon, and the 3 of you that are here. This hearing showed the great benefits to the public that come from the infrastructure laws. Investment in public transit will see great benefits in other infrastructure sectors. Thanks to the witnesses for your testimony. For senators who wish to submit questions for the hearing record, these questions are due 1 week from today on Tuesday, March 22nd. To the 5 witnesses, please submit responses to questions for the record within 45 days from the day you receive them. Thank you all for joining us. The hearing is adjourned.